The streetlights were still casting their glow on the sidewalk when Laura Bennett vanished in Danville, Illinois, a Midwestern town where every street was familiar and every evening passed in the same rhythm. It was an autumn night in 1994, no storm, no special event, when Laura left after a completely ordinary evening, carrying her usual habits and a promise to be home on time. A few people still remember seeing her walk toward the end of the street, her figure gradually fading in the pale yellow light, an image too familiar to become a suspicious memory. When the clock passed the time Laura usually appeared at the door, unanswered calls began ringing in quiet anxiety. No one in Danville knew that, from that moment, the town would enter a story stretching decades, where every wrong assumption and every overlooked detail would silently determine the fate of a person. Before diving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. Danville, Illinois, on an autumn evening in 1994 was so quiet you could almost hear time passing, the narrow streets nearly empty of cars, the yellow lights stretching evenly across the familiar sidewalks, the shops closing early as usual, in a town where unusual things rarely happened. Laura Bennett ended her evening in the most ordinary way possible, no arguments with anyone, no hurry, no unsettling message left behind, no sign that just hours later her name would be spoken in trembling voices. She left the familiar place with steps free of worry, walking the road she had taken countless times, where the street lights shone on the patchy concrete, where the few remaining people in sight were just faint silhouettes of a night nearing its end. Some remember seeing Laura walk toward the end of the street, her slender figure gradually disappearing between light and shadow, an image so utterly ordinary that no one felt the need to commit it to memory, let alone think it was the last moment they would see her alive. Time passed slowly in the way only nights of waiting can, and when the clock moved past the hour Laura usually came home, the silence began to take on a different tone. At first, the family just thought she was late, maybe stopped somewhere a little longer, maybe caught up in conversation and forgot the time. Familiar assumptions repeated to soothe the very faint worry just starting to spark. The phone was picked up, Laura's number dialed, then dialed again, the ring echoing into empty space with no one answering, and each time, the unease thickened by a thin layer. The night dragged into the early hours, Danville sank into sleep, but in the Bennett family home, no one could sleep. The lights stayed on, footsteps sounded then stopped, eyes kept glancing at the door, as if Laura might appear at any moment. The feeling that something wasn't right began to emerge clearly, not panic, but an indefinable offbeat rhythm, as if something familiar had just been pulled from its place. When dawn approached and Laura still hadn't returned, the waiting no longer wore the face of patience, it became a smoldering worry, weighing heavily on every minute, every second. Morning arrived in pale light, the town woke up as usual, but Laura Bennett did not. Her room remained empty, the door stayed silent, and by then, the family could no longer keep reassuring themselves. The call was made in a tense voice, words scattered as they tried to describe something simple yet terrifying. Laura had not come home all night. On the other end of the line, the information was received, and at that moment, with a decision made in confusion, Laura Bennett was officially reported missing, a name recorded, marking the moment a person disappeared from the ordinary rhythm of life in Danville. The Bennett family's call was received at the Danville Police Department that morning, as the town was just beginning a new day that seemed no different from hundreds of mornings before. In the small duty room, the officer picked up the receiver and listened to the voice on the other end, a voice trying to stay calm but unable to hide the strain. Danville was no stranger to calls about people not coming home on time, but from the very first sentences, the information the family provided made this case impossible to brush off. With advice to wait a few more hours, Laura Bennett, 23 years old, had left home the previous evening and not returned. Her phone was unreachable, and most importantly, this was completely out of character for her daily routine. In less than an hour, an official missing person file was opened, Laura's name recorded, the time of receipt stamped, and responsibility handed over to the investigation team. The investigators began by gathering basic but foundational information, the data that would determine the direction of every next step. They asked the family about the last time Laura was seen, who spoke to her last, and under what circumstances. Timelines were carefully noted, not just by the hour, but with the small accompanying details, like whether Laura seemed tired, what her mood was, and what she said before leaving. At the same time, Laura's daily routine was reconstructed, her work hours, the routes she usually took, how her weekday evenings typically went, and whether she had ever disappeared without notice before. The answers the investigators received were quite consistent. Laura had a stable life, no history of running away, no signs of preparing for a sudden trip, and no major conflicts known to the family. A list of places Laura frequented was quickly compiled, from her workplace, familiar spots in town, to the streets she often walked home on. All were within Danville, a town where distances between locations were close enough to make movement predictable. The investigators marked these places on a map, trying to spot a pattern, an anomaly that might explain Laura's disappearance. Once the initial information was fully gathered, they sat down to establish a key point: Laura Bennett's official last seen alive. This was not just a procedural detail, but the temporal anchor for the entire investigation, the point every question about before and after had to circle back to. After cross-checking statements and eliminating vague information, the last seen alive was agreed upon, creating a clear time frame for the final hours. Laura was known to be safe. Within the first 24 hours, a critical professional decision was made, one that would profoundly affect how the case was handled. Based on what had been gathered, the Danville police determined this was not a case of an adult voluntarily leaving without reason, but a suspicious disappearance requiring priority. This decision meant Laura's file was not placed in the monitor and wait category, but assigned to a lead investigator responsible for compiling information, coordinating next steps, and reporting progress. Time pressure was established from the start, as the investigators knew the first hours were the most critical in any missing person case. However, it was in that urgency that the first mistake began to form, quietly and almost unnoticed. Based on available information and experience with similar cases, the investigators accepted what seemed a reasonable assumption: Laura had left the familiar area, along the exact route she usually took, and if something happened, it occurred along that path. This assumption quickly became the foundation for many initial decisions, from questioning witnesses to envisioning Laura's final hours. It allowed them to act quickly and with direction, but it also narrowed the scope of thinking, making other possibilities less considered. In the police department's workroom, notes gradually piled up. A simple diagram of the evening Laura vanished was sketched, with arrows indicating the direction of movement the investigators believed was logical. They contacted people who might have seen Laura the previous evening, recorded statements, compared times, and tried to piece the fragments into a coherent story. At that point, there were no clear signs of violence, no direct evidence Laura was in immediate danger, and this very absence caused some harder questions to be temporarily set aside. When the file was completed on the first day, it carried both the determination to uncover the truth and the invisible limits created by those initial assumptions. For the Bennett family, the police quickly opening a file was a fragile comfort. For the investigators, it was the start of a race they believed could be resolved if they acted fast enough. But on that quiet morning in Danville, when Laura Bennett's name was officially entered into the missing persons log, no one could know that the decisions made in those first 24 hours would leave their mark on the entire journey ahead for the case. Immediately after Laura Bennett's missing person file was opened, and the first professional decisions were made, the Danville Police Department entered the phase every case like this must go through, if there is still hope of an early answer: organized searching. No longer scattered inquiries or waiting for information to surface on its own. This search was built on what the investigators believed they knew in the first 24 hours. A plan was drawn up on paper, starting with determining a search radius from Laura's official last seen alive point, then gradually expanding along the routes she likely took that night. On the map of Danville spread across the meeting table, concentric circles were drawn, Laura's familiar routes marked, and each area clearly assigned to different search teams, with the goal of leaving no space unchecked within the reachable range during the time she vanished. Search teams were deployed across the town, starting from the nearest areas and moving outward. They checked residential neighborhoods, little-used alleys, vacant lots, areas along the Vermilion River, and even the roads connecting Danville to nearby towns. Each location was approached with the same procedure: overall observation, looking for unusual traces, questioning anyone present nearby, and recording everything, no matter how small. Danville wasn't a place with much wilderness, but that very familiarity sometimes made anomalies easy to overlook, amid scenes everyone thought they knew well. The investigators followed the route the initial assumption had outlined, believing that if something happened to Laura, evidence would be somewhere along the path she usually took. During the search, the first details began to emerge, and for the first time since Laura vanished, the case was no longer just an invisible absence. In an area outside the prioritized route, but still within the search radius, an item was discovered, something closely associated with Laura, that the family confirmed belonged to her. This was the first physical evidence, and immediately, the search atmosphere changed. The discovery area was sealed off, a secondary scene established per procedure, and all surrounding activity paused, to ensure nothing remaining was disturbed. The item showed no signs of destruction or hasty discarding. It lay there in a way that made it hard for investigators to determine whether this was a coincidental clue or the result of a more complex chain of events. Forensic specialists recorded the exact discovery position in detail, took photos, measured distances to nearby landmarks, and asked why one of Laura's belongings would appear here. Though this was progress from having nothing, it also raised more questions than answers. There were no signs of struggle in the area, no drag marks, no blood or any indicators of violence occurring right there. This left the investigators in a dilemma. The evidence reinforced that Laura had not vanished completely without trace voluntarily, but it also provided no clear information on what happened to her. The search plan was adjusted based on the new find, the radius expanded further, and teams were asked to recheck previous areas more thoroughly. Side streets, little-noticed turns, and spaces that seemed unrelated were all added to the list for review. However, the more they searched, the fainter the results. No additional evidence was found, no new witnesses emerged with breakthrough information, and no clear signs led the investigators to a specific scenario. Pressure began to mount with each passing day. The investigators knew every hour without progress reduced the chance of finding Laura safe. They had to balance continuing to expand the search with focusing on analyzing what they already had. Quick meetings happened more frequently, maps were constantly updated, and the initial assumptions were repeated as a compass for every decision. However, clinging tightly to that assumption also caused them to miss asking other questions that might have led to search directions outside the established framework. Meanwhile, Danville began to feel the quiet tension spreading. The police presence in various areas, yellow tape appearing and disappearing, and news of finding Laura's item quickly circulated, even without official release. For the investigators, each search was not just scanning terrain, but a battle of wits with time and their own assumptions. They noted no clear signs of struggle in any checked area, a detail that relieved them from seeing violence, yet worried them because they didn't know where to search next. When the first day of organized searching ended, Laura Bennett's file had thickened with field reports, area diagrams, and lists of checked locations, but the core question remained intact. No clear progress, no decisive clue, just a single isolated piece of evidence out of context, and a series of unverified assumptions. The pressure came not only from time but from the awareness that if the current search direction was wrong, every passing hour was taking them further from the truth. In the lighted meeting room of the Danville Police Department, the investigators looked again at the map covered in red marks, understanding that the organized search phase had only just begun, and that the lack of results now was not the end, but a sign of a case far more complex than they had imagined in the first 24 hours. After days of organized searching that yielded no clear results, the focus of the investigation had to shift from space to time. Once the areas around Danville had been thoroughly checked without uncovering any new traces, the investigators returned to their desks, where maps covered in marker notes were folded away, making room for paper, pens, recording tapes, and timelines. They began reconstructing every marker in the evening. Laura Bennett vanished, not to find more locations, but to understand exactly what happened in the final hours when she was last seen. The goal now was to turn what seemed like an ordinary night into a specific sequence of events, where every minute had its place and every gap needed explanation. The initial timeline was drawn up based on what had been gathered in the first 24 hours, the time Laura left the familiar place, the direction she walked, and the window when the family began realizing she wasn't coming home. The investigators divided that evening into small segments, each corresponding to a time marker they believed could be verified through statements or indirect data. They called witnesses back, asking them to describe more precisely what they had seen, not just when, but also what happened before and after. Questions were asked in the same pattern to limit memory being led, but the more they asked, the more differences between accounts became apparent. When comparing statements from people in the area that evening, the investigators realized not everyone remembered the same time for the same event. Some insisted they saw Laura at an earlier time than others recalled, while certain accounts placed her at the same location but later. These differences were initially seen as normal, since human memory is rarely perfectly accurate, especially for events that seemed unimportant at the time. However, when the time markers were placed side by side on the timeline board, the discrepancies became hard to ignore. They weren't minor errors of a few minutes, but gaps large enough to change the understanding of the evening's sequence. The investigators began testing multiple versions of the timeline, each based on a different arrangement of statements. They shifted time markers, adjusted event order, and checked which scenario could account for the most accounts without creating new contradictions. It was during this process that a notable gap began to emerge. It was a stretch of time with no direct statements, no confirming witnesses, and no attachment to any specific activity of Laura's that they could verify. This gap lay between two seemingly solid markers, creating a gray area in the night Laura vanished. At first, the gap wasn't seen as a major issue. The investigators reasoned that Laura might simply have walked a short distance unnoticed, or been in a space without witnesses. In a small town like Danville, periods when no one sees each other aren't rare, especially in the evening when people are home. So the gap was noted, but not marked as high priority. Instead, they continued focusing on clarifying time markers with witnesses, believing that if something unusual happened, it would show up in more populated points. However, building the timeline wasn't just piecing together statements, it was cross-referencing them with Laura's recorded daily habits. When the investigators placed her usual schedule alongside the disappearance night timeline, they noticed the gap fell exactly at the time when Laura, by habit, would have been very close to home. This created a small but notable contradiction. If Laura was moving along her familiar route, that time period should have had at least some indirect sign, even if just a neighbor remembering seeing her pass by. The complete absence of information in this segment made the timeline disjointed, like a film with a section cut out for no known reason. The investigators discussed this gap in short meetings, but pressure from the lack of clear progress forced them to make choices. They decided the gap, though notable, wasn't enough to shift the investigation's direction at that point. There was no physical evidence directly tied to this time segment, no new witnesses emerging, and no sign something unusual occurred in those exact minutes. In a context of limited resources and the need to focus on more concrete leads, the gap was assessed as a secondary detail, something they could return to later if needed. The timeline was temporarily finalized with the time markers the investigators deemed most reliable, and that gap was left as an undetermined zone. On the board, it was just a blank stretch between two lines, not highlighted or flagged for warning. For those building the timeline, it was merely an incomplete part of the picture, a detail that might be filled in with more information. But precisely because it wasn't prioritized, the gap gradually sank beneath other tasks, making way for new hypotheses and directions they thought more likely to yield quicker results. As the workday ended, the investigators looked back at the timeline board with a feeling of having advanced one step yet missing something important. They had turned a vague night into an ordered sequence of events, identified specific time markers, and mismatched points in statements. But amid all those lines and notes, the gap still existed, quietly, and not given due attention. At that moment, no one in the room believed that this undervalued time segment would become the key piece to understanding what really happened to Laura Bennett on the night she vanished. Reconstructing the timeline of the night Laura Bennett vanished left too many unanswered questions, and it was precisely those gaps in time that forced the investigators to turn back to more tangible elements, things that could be located and checked with the naked eye. In reviewing all the information gathered from the family and acquaintances, a detail that seemed obvious gradually stood out. The means of transportation tied to Laura's daily life had not yet been clarified satisfactorily. For a small town like Danville, where most people travel by personal vehicle and familiar routes rarely change, determining the final location of the vehicle is often a crucial step in missing person cases. The investigators began asking not just where Laura went, but where her vehicle was at that time, and whether it reflected the initial assumption about her route. Clarifying the related vehicle didn't happen immediately. At first, the investigators had to recheck what the family provided, cross-reference with notes and scattered information from the early search days. When Laura's vehicle was finally identified and its location clarified, the initial reaction in the workspace was surprise mixed with doubt. The discovery location didn't fit the usual route Laura took, and it didn't match the timeline the investigators had built on the initial assumption. It was in an area Laura had almost no reason to visit at that time, especially at night, and this immediately shook the assumption that she had simply traveled her familiar path. The investigators went to the site to directly examine the discovery scene. This area wasn't on a main road, nor a spot easily noticed by passers-by. The vehicle was parked neatly, with no signs of collision, no debris, no skid marks or any indicators of an accident. Its exterior condition quickly led investigators to rule out the possibility Laura had an accident and left the scene in panic. Everything was too intact, too orderly, as if the vehicle had been placed there intentionally, not as the result of an unexpected incident. Inside the vehicle, there were no clear signs of disturbance, no blood, no scattered belongings, nothing suggesting a struggle had occurred. This created an uncomfortable paradox for the investigators. The vehicle was the most concrete clue they had so far, yet it provided no clear answers. It didn't tell them a story of an accident, nor of obvious violence. Instead, it just sat there silently, like a big question mark about how Laura got there and why she didn't leave with her vehicle. When the vehicle was sealed and added to the official evidence list, the investigation atmosphere changed markedly. This was no longer a disappearance based solely on accounts and speculation. There was now a physical object to focus analysis on. The investigators compiled detailed records of the discovery location, distances to familiar timeline markers, and time needed to travel between points. Every figure placed side by side highlighted the irrationality. Further, if Laura followed her usual route, she had no reason to bring the vehicle here. If she deliberately turned off course, why was there no one who saw or noted the change? This very irrationality began planting seeds of new doubt in the investigators' minds. If the vehicle didn't naturally end up there, and if Laura had no personal reason to go to this area, then the possibility of third-party involvement was no longer a far-fetched hypothesis. This doubt didn't explode into a conclusion immediately, but it was strong enough to make the investigators review the entire timeline with fresh eyes. The once undervalued time gap was now placed alongside the vehicle's discovery location, and for the first time, the two elements began to connect. In internal meetings, Laura's vehicle quickly became referenced as the case's central evidence. Every new investigative direction had to answer how did the vehicle get here, who drove it, and at what time. These questions led to a series of professional consequences, from rechecking witness statements to considering the possibility Laura wasn't alone in her final minutes that evening. Though there was no direct evidence pointing to a third party's presence, the assumption that Laura might have encountered someone just before vanishing began to be discussed more seriously than ever. The vehicle's appearance in an illogical location didn't bring an immediate solution, but it changed the investigation's nature. The investigators were no longer just searching for a missing person. They were trying to decode a deliberate chain of actions, with the vehicle as a key link. Pressure mounted as they realized every day without clarifying this question, reduced the chance of gathering more information. In Danville's relative quiet, Laura Bennett's vehicle became the most tangible symbol of her absence, an object standing still but forcing the investigation to move in a new direction, where suspicion of third-party involvement could no longer be ignored. Once the vehicle linked to Laura Bennett was identified and became central evidence, the investigation's focus naturally shifted to the unavoidable question: who was the last person known to have been near Laura before she vanished? In missing person cases, this is always the most sensitive knot, as it narrows the scope from a large town down to one or two specific individuals, and where the accident assumption often gives way to the possibility of human involvement. The investigators reviewed all gathered statements, cross-referenced them with the newly built timeline, and sequentially eliminated names unfit by time or location. Finally, one person emerged as the intersection of multiple markers, the last individual various differing accounts placed near Laura in the final minutes of that evening. Identifying this person didn't come from a dramatic clue, but from the quiet overlap of seemingly harmless details. One account mentioned a short conversation, another referred to seeing two people leave around the same time, and when time markers were placed together, that name could no longer be overlooked. The investigators prepared for the interview with high caution, knowing this could be the most direct contact with the truth since Laura vanished. There were no clear grounds for arrest, no physical evidence for confrontation. All they had was time, location, and questions needing consistent answers. The interview took place in a tense but controlled atmosphere. The investigators began by establishing the exact time this person interacted with Laura, asking them to recount that evening in sequence, from meeting Laura to parting ways. Time was referenced repeatedly, under different phrasings, to test the stability of the memory. The person being interviewed provided specific time markers, not overly detailed to the point of suspicion, but not vague either, a presentation that made it hard for the investigators to find points to challenge. Next came the route. They asked about the path taken, the places stopped at, and the reasons for each choice. The description was given quite fluently, fitting the area map and showing no clear contradictions with what the investigators already knew. The explanation for parting from Laura was presented as the normal end to an ordinary evening. No arguments, no signs of tension, no reason for that encounter to be more memorable than hundreds of others. The investigators circled back to the same questions in various ways, trying different angles, posing alternative assumptions to gauge reactions, but the core story maintained surface consistency. No sudden changes in tone, no new details emerging then retracted, and most importantly, no direct contradictions with other collected statements. For verification, the investigators cross-checked this statement against the established timeline. The time markers placed side by side showed this person was near Laura, right before the time gap appeared in the timeline, but there was no evidence proving they were together throughout that segment. The gap still existed, but it wasn't filled by anyone's certain presence. This left the interview in an uncomfortable stalemate. The person interviewed had proximity, had opportunity, but no specific action directly tied to Laura's disappearance. The investigators continued expanding the scope of questions, seeking small details that might reveal inconsistency, but every effort only yielded answers reasonable in the context of the time. No prior record, no history of violence, and no evidence the relationship between this person and Laura went beyond ordinary acquaintance. These factors, when placed in a legal framework, quickly became the biggest barrier to holding the person. The investigators understood that suspicion, no matter how strong, could not replace specific legal grounds. After hours of interviewing and cross-checking information, a tentative conclusion was reached with clear reluctance. The statement was coherent, showed no surface contradictions, and there was no physical evidence directly linking this person to Laura's disappearance. In that context, holding the person not only lacked basis, but risked weakening the entire case if challenged. The person interviewed was allowed to leave, with a note that they would be contacted again if more questions arose. This decision left a heavy feeling in the investigation room. Procedurally, it was the right choice, but intuitively, many investigators still felt something didn't fit. The most significant potential suspect at that point was temporarily ruled out, not because proven innocent, but due to lacking the necessary pieces to assign responsibility. As the interview room door closed, Laura Bennett's file fell back into its familiar state of ambiguity, where questions outnumbered answers, and every decision carried the risk of having missed something important. In the end-of-day notes, the name of the last person near Laura was still circled, not as a conclusion, but as a big question mark awaiting a return, while the investigation had to continue seeking other directions. After the last person known to have been near Laura Bennett was temporarily ruled out, due to insufficient legal grounds, the investigation entered an uncomfortable but familiar phase, where the sense of stalemate forced the investigators to seek another direction to avoid standing still. Unable to continue focusing all attention on an individual, thoroughly interviewed without yielding clear contradictions, the team decided to broaden hypotheses, turning to less direct possibilities that seemed reasonable in the context of a disappearance, without obvious signs of violence. The focus gradually shifted from the hypothesis of direct involvement by an acquaintance to other scenarios, where Laura might have left her familiar route on her own for some reason, or encountered an unforeseen situation unrelated to the last person she contacted. This shift led to investigative resources being spread across multiple directions at once. One group was assigned to re-examine Laura's broader social relationships, including casual acquaintances, recent chance encounters, and seemingly insignificant connections. Another group focused on checking indirect possibilities, such as Laura potentially suffering a medical issue, temporary panic, or voluntarily leaving in an unstable mental state. These hypotheses didn't stem from specific evidence, but from the need to keep moving when the main direction yielded no results. In that context, each possibility was considered relatively seriously, though none truly stood out. At the same time, investigators began revisiting some details noted early on, but not prioritized, hoping to find a new point that could open another path. They rechecked calls Laura might have received or made before vanishing, reviewed places she visited in the preceding days, and looked for any signs she might have planned a change in routine. However, the deeper they dug, the more fragmented the picture became. The gathered information didn't contradict itself, but it also didn't converge enough to form a strong hypothesis. During this process, time pressure continued to weigh heavily on the team. Each day without clear progress reduced the chances of finding new leads, while public attention and external support gradually cooled. To demonstrate the case was still being actively handled, investigators had to pursue multiple directions simultaneously. Knowing this meant none were explored to their full depth. Internal meetings became more frequent, but instead of revolving around a clear investigative thread, they focused on allocating resources and deciding which hypothesis to prioritize that day. It was during this phase that an important clue began to be quietly pushed to the sidelines. The time gap in the timeline of the night Laura vanished, along with the unusual location of the related vehicle, which had once unsettled many investigators, was no longer central in discussions. It wasn't dismissed, but neither was it pursued further. Amid constantly emerging new hypotheses, that gap was seen as a difficult detail, lacking specific data, and thus not offering immediate actionable value. Questions around it were noted with a promise to return later, when more information was available. Setting aside this clue wasn't a deliberate decision made in a major meeting, but the result of a series of small choices, each seeming reasonable at the time. When choosing between pursuing a new hypothesis that might yield quick results and digging deeper into a time gap without additional data, investigators often lean toward the former. Gradually, attention drifted from the break in the timeline, and it sank beneath other layers of the file, awaiting an indefinite time to be revisited. The spreading of resources also made tracking known details less rigorous. Old statements were no longer regularly cross-referenced with new hypotheses, and the related vehicle, though still considered central evidence on paper, was no longer the starting point for every question as before. New investigators joining the case took time to familiarize themselves with the massive accumulated information, and in that process, they often focused on hot investigative directions, rather than details existing from the start. In retrospect, this phase was like a fork the investigation had to take. Shifting to other hypotheses helped the team keep moving forward, avoiding complete stalemate, but it came at the cost of dispersion and lost focus. A major clue wasn't forgotten, but set aside, waiting until other directions were exhausted. In one investigator's notebook, next to the description of the time gap on the night Laura vanished, there was a small dot drawn in the margin, not as a conclusion, but as a vague reminder that something remained unexplained. As the investigation veered into other hypotheses and resources were spread thin, Laura Bennett's file gradually thickened in a way few noticed, not with new discoveries, but with small pieces of information recorded and filed in their proper administrative places. Among them was a short report, just a few pages, completed by a frontline officer in the early search days. This report contained nothing shocking, no new physical findings, only noting an observation related to timing and location that the writer deemed uncertain. Precisely because of that caution, the report was quickly filed under reference materials, not brought to formal discussion in investigative meetings. That report mentioned a seemingly unimportant timing detail, a marker recorded later than what the official timeline was using. The report's author didn't assert it as fact, only noting that this marker came from an indirect source, needing further cross-checking if possible. In the context of the team handling dozens of other tasks, that reminder didn't generate the necessary attention. The timeline had been built, temporarily finalized to serve ongoing investigative directions, and revisiting it for an unverified note was seen as non-urgent. Parallel to that report was a statement, recorded in a brief interview with someone present in the area the night Laura vanished. This statement didn't directly contradict known information, but it also didn't fully align. The witness recalled seeing Laura at a time different from the official last seen alive marker, but due to uncertainty, they didn't emphasize the detail and weren't probed further. The statement was saved, marked as supplementary information, and not cross-verified with other accounts in the same time frame. In the phase where the investigation was seeking actionable leads, such details were easily overlooked. They weren't strong enough to change direction, nor clear enough to create a new hypothesis. The investigators, under pressure to show progress, prioritized information with potential for quicker results. A small report not cross-checked against the timeline, a statement not cross-verified, all set aside with a promise to return when more data was available. This overlooking didn't have the appearance of an obvious mistake. It was the result of a series of reasonable decisions in the specific context of the time. The timeline had been constructed to bring order to a chaotic night, and constantly adjusting it based on unverified information could make the entire investigative structure chaotic. So the investigators chose to keep the agreed-upon timeframe intact, viewing offbeat details as noise, explainable by human memory errors. Yet that very offbeat discrepancy was the most noteworthy. If that report had been placed next to the official timeline, it would have shown an unusual overlap with the once mentioned but unprioritized time gap. If that statement had been cross-verified with other accounts, it might have shaken the assumption that Laura followed her familiar route throughout the evening. But at that time, those connections weren't drawn. The documents existed in parallel, each in its own folder, without intersecting, without dialoguing. As resources continued to be spread across other hypotheses, that small report sank deeper into the file. It wasn't discarded, wasn't deemed wrong, simply not called upon in subsequent discussions. New investigators, joining the case, often skimmed it as part of the background, but since it wasn't referenced in major decisions, they didn't place heavy importance on it. The uncross-verified statement met the same fate, existing as a marginal note in an increasingly complex case. Only years later, when the file was reopened, and each document page examined with fresh eyes, did these overlooked details begin to emerge as important pieces. When new investigators placed that small report next to the once standard timeline, they realized the discrepancy wasn't noise, but a sign. When that statement was cross-referenced with other accounts, it was no longer a vague memory, but an indicator that the sequence of events that night had been misunderstood from the very beginning. As new hypotheses gradually ran dry, and investigative directions successively hit dead ends, the atmosphere at the Danville Police Department began to change, in a way that was hard to notice unless you were inside the investigation. There was no major meeting declaring that the Laura Bennett case had stalled, no official milestone marking the end of the active investigation phase, just a gradual thinning of concrete actions. Meetings grew shorter, new reports became fewer, and familiar questions started being answered with the same phrase, no additional information. The gap in the timeline, the small uncross-checked report, and the unverified statement remained there, but were no longer mentioned in daily exchanges. When no new investigative steps strong enough to pursue remained, the case slowly slid into a waiting state. The original lead investigators kept the file on their desks for a while, occasionally flipping through pages in hopes a detail would suddenly stand out, but in reality, nothing changed. Inquiries from Laura's family grew less frequent, not because they stopped caring, but because they had heard the same answer repeatedly. In that context, the pressure to allocate resources to new cases, where clearer results were possible, grew increasingly strong. The decision to shift the file to cold case status wasn't made in a dramatic moment, but as the result of a series of administrative evaluations. Supervisors reviewed the list of open cases, weighing time elapsed, remaining leads, and the feasibility of continuing investigation with available resources. For the Laura Bennett case, every criterion pointed in the same direction: no viable new investigative steps in the short term. The file was remarked, status changed in the system, and from that point, the case was officially considered cold. Shifting to cold case brought a series of procedural changes with profound impact. Related physical evidence, including items collected in the early phase, was inventoried one last time before sealing. Each item was noted for condition, seizure time, and discovery location, then packaged per standards for storage. As the evidence boxes were labeled and shelved, they were no longer the focus of daily discussions, but became waiting objects, lying still in the dim storage vault, where hundreds of other cases rested in similar silence. Laura's paper file was gathered, tied, and placed in a larger storage box. Reports once written with urgency now were just stacked pages, each representing a decision, an assumption, and a direction that yielded no results. Overlooked details didn't vanish, but they lost the chance to be questioned at the right time. In cold case status, the file was no longer routinely updated, opened only when new information strong enough to change the situation emerged. For investigators involved from the start, the case going cold carried an indefinable sense of failure. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood there were unanswered questions and decisions made under pressure that in hindsight might look different. However, in the rhythm of a small police department, that feeling was quickly overtaken by new cases, new calls, and new files needing priority. Laura Bennett gradually became a familiar but distant name, mentioned when asked, but rarely appearing in strategic meetings. Over time, the case's existence in cold case status created a particular distance between past and present. New investigators joining the force knew Laura only through the file, through outdated reports, without vivid memories of the early search days. For them, it was an unsolved disappearance on a long list of files awaiting a miracle. Evidence was carefully sealed, but that very care made it rarely accessed again, unless there was compelling reason. The Laura Bennett case wasn't closed, but it was set aside, in a suspended state between being remembered and forgotten. No new investigative steps, no urgent meetings, just a stored file with slim hope that one day a new detail would emerge and force the storage door open again. In the silence of passing years, the cold case marked not just a pause in investigation, but evidence of how time can blur even the most urgent questions, if nothing strong enough pulls them back into the light. Many years after Laura Bennett's file was placed in cold case status, long enough for those directly involved in the initial investigation to have transferred, retired, or remember the case only as a faint name in professional memory, the decision to reopen the file didn't come from a dramatic breakthrough. No new witness emerged, no unexpected evidence was found, and no late confession forced the evidence vault open. Reopening stemmed from a systemic change. The Danville Police Department established a dedicated cold case unit, tasked with reviewing unsolved missing persons and homicide files spanning decades. On that list, Laura Bennett's name stood out not for fame, but for the prolonged silence surrounding it. When the cold case unit officially took over the file, their approach differed vastly from the tense pace of 1994. No longer under pressure to decide in hours or days, they had what the original investigators lacked: time and emotional distance. The new investigators carried no personal assumptions about Laura, no memories of exhausting search days, and no ties to past choices. They approached the file as a historical document, where each decision needed understanding in its context, but wasn't exempt from questioning. The review process began systematically. Every file page was reread from start to finish, including short reports once relegated to appendices. Investigators didn't just read for content, but noted the 1994 investigation's thought sequence, why one hypothesis was prioritized, another sidelined, and what shifted the case from urgent to waiting to cold. They built an investigation timeline, parallel to the night Laura vanished, to clearly see links between emerging information and professional decisions at each point. It was during this that the cold case unit realized many key 1994 decisions rested on assumptions never re-examined. Once accepted, those assumptions drove the entire investigation, as if obvious truths. Original investigators acted reasonably amid scarce information and high pressure, but as time passed, assumptions went unchallenged, becoming fixed foundations. No formal mechanism forced revisiting those foundations, and when the case went cold, everything froze unfinished. One assumption particularly drew the cold case unit's attention: the understanding of Laura's movement the night she vanished. The 1994 file defaulted to her taking the familiar route, and from that, everything else followed. Search areas, witness statement evaluations, even identifying the last person near her. When the cold case unit asked the simple but fundamental question, what if this assumption is wrong? The picture began shifting. Investigators tried reconstructing the entire case without relying on the familiar route. They didn't immediately replace it with another, but first examined details once treated as outliers: the vehicle's unusual location, the timeline gap, and the small uncross-checked report. Placed together under the new assumption, these were no longer scattered fragments, but began fitting in an alarming way. The time gap, once undervalued for lacking witnesses, now became the critical phase where the old assumption explained nothing. The cold case unit dug deeper by re-examining every 1994 decision related to this gap. They found early signs the timeline was incomplete, but because they didn't fit the familiar route assumption, they were dismissed as noise. The small report once sidelined was now reread with special attention, and when cross-checked with the unverified statement, it revealed an event sequence differing from the official version. Overlooked details weren't ignored for lacking value, but because they didn't fit the story the investigation had told itself. Challenging old assumptions wasn't about criticizing predecessors, but understanding how the case derailed. The cold case unit noted no careless errors or serious procedural violations, but a systemic flaw: initial assumptions stopped being treated as assumptions and became truths. As time passed without progress, questioning those foundations grew harder, until completely overlooked. Reopening didn't yield immediate answers, but it changed how investigators viewed the case. Laura Bennett was no longer seen as someone vanishing on a familiar route, but as an individual whose path that night was never properly understood. This led to new questions, not about uninvestigated aspects, but about investigated ones based on flawed premises. When the cold case unit completed the initial review, they agreed reopening wasn't just continuing the old investigation, but rewriting it from scratch. One old assumption was questioned, and with it, the entire case entered a new phase, where patience, skepticism, and willingness to acknowledge past blind spots became the most important tools. For Laura Bennett, for the first time in years, the file was no longer gathering dust in storage, but back on desks, opening the possibility that questions long dormant might finally be answered. When the old assumption about Laura Bennett's path the night she vanished was questioned, the cold case unit understood they couldn't rely solely on rereading files and rebuilding timelines on paper. To break decades-long speculation loops, they needed something more concrete, objective, unaffected by flawed memories or human time pressure. The near-obvious but risky choice was returning to sealed evidence stored since 1994. For years, this evidence existed as static proof, preserved properly but rarely re-accessed, as technology then couldn't extract more. The cold case unit inventoried all Laura Bennett-related evidence, each item removed from storage with utmost caution. Every sealed container was opened under supervision, evidence condition re-noted to confirm no tampering during storage. For new investigators, this wasn't just technical procedure but symbolic. The first time in years, objects tied to early searches were under lab lights again. They knew everything might remain silent, but technology had advanced, and what was unreadable in 1994 might tell a different story now. The decision to retest evidence had a clear goal: seek any biological traces, overlooked or unanalyzable with old technology. Samples were carefully selected, prioritizing once central evidence, especially vehicle-related items, and Laura's personal belongings. These were sent to labs specializing in next-generation DNA analysis, capable of isolating and amplifying minute biological traces, once deemed unusable. Waiting for results occurred in tense silence. Investigators didn't expect miracles, accustomed to such efforts, often yielding negatives. But when the first report arrived, it immediately shattered caution. In one specific sample, the lab detected DNA traces not belonging to Laura Bennett. This wasn't storage contamination, but a clear enough biological profile to confirm it belonged to someone else. This discovery created an instant turning point in viewing the case. For the first time, the investigation wasn't just abstract hypotheses about paths or time, but had physical evidence pointing to another person's presence in Laura's disappearance context. Investigators rechecked evidence chain of custody to rule out errors, then compared results to known data. The DNA didn't match anyone in Laura's file, not family, not acquaintances sampled before. This made one possibility clearer than ever: Laura had close contact with a third party at a critical time, leaving traces old technology couldn't detect. The cold case unit quickly expanded testing to other evidence, not expecting everything to speak, but to see if this was an outlier or part of a larger picture. Some samples yielded nothing new, but that didn't diminish the initial findings' value. Instead, it reinforced the DNA wasn't noise, but a specific trace tied to a specific situation. Investigators began re-asking old questions in new light. Who was this third party? When did they appear in the night Laura vanished? And why wasn't their presence identified in the original investigation? The discovery of DNA not belonging to Laura also forced the cold case unit to revisit details once overlooked. The time gap in the timeline was no longer a vague zone, but a period that could contain significant interaction between Laura and the third party. The unusual vehicle location, once seen as hard to explain, began to make more sense when placed alongside the possibility of someone else involved in moving or arranging it. The small uncross-checked reports and unverified statements now became potential pieces, capable of helping establish the context in which that DNA sample appeared. Most importantly, this was the first time in years that the investigation had a clear direction. Instead of expanding hypotheses in every direction, the cold case unit now had a specific goal: identify the unknown DNA profile and clarify its connection to Laura Bennett. They began planning to compare this profile against existing databases, while assessing the potential use of new methods, like genetic genealogy if necessary. The change in the work atmosphere was undeniable. Meetings that had been heavy with review now became more focused and purposeful. Investigators no longer asked "Where did Laura go?" in a general way, but who was with Laura, and when. Evidence, once considered silent for years, now became the strongest voice in the investigation room. It didn't tell the whole story, but it indicated that the story wasn't Laura's alone. The discovery of DNA not belonging to Laura Bennett wasn't the final answer, but it was the first door to open after years of stalemate. For the first time, the cold case unit could chart an investigative path based on scientific evidence, not just assumptions and speculation. In the long journey of the case, this was the moment physical evidence truly spoke, not just to remind that the past still held traces, but to affirm that truth, no matter how long buried, could be awakened when people knew how to listen properly. The discovery of the DNA sample not belonging to Laura Bennett propelled the investigation into an entirely new phase, but it also presented a cold reality. Knowing a third party was present the night Laura vanished was still not enough for legal action. When the DNA profile was entered into traditional criminal databases, the result was 0 matches. No direct hits, no prior records, no name ready to appear on screen. For the cold case unit, this wasn't discouraging, as they had anticipated it. A case from 1994 almost certainly involved an individual never sampled in the criminal system, or at least never leaving stored traces. Thus, the next choice was no longer whether, but when genetic genealogy. The decision to apply genetic genealogy came after extensive internal discussions and legal consultations. Investigators understood this method wasn't a shortcut to a name, but a complex journey requiring time, resources, and collaboration among various experts. The DNA sample was reprocessed to fit civilian genealogy databases, where millions had voluntarily uploaded genetic information for finding relatives or exploring ancestry. Unlike criminal database matching, genetic genealogy works through distant connections, third or fourth cousins, even further, and traces back to a common ancestor. When initial results arrived, they didn't bring triumph, but resembled an incomplete map. The list of genetic matches was ranked by similarity, each name representing a potential family branch. Investigators, with genealogy experts, began building family trees, a manual, meticulous process bordering on obsessive. They traced birth certificates, marriage records, immigration files, and other public documents to connect the links. Each branch expanded across generations, then pruned when no longer fitting case criteria. The family tree gradually emerged on the whiteboard in the workspace, with crisscrossing lines and dense notes. Investigators didn't rely solely on genetic links, but applied practical filters: individuals' ages in 1994, likelihood of living in or visiting Danville, Illinois, and family migration history. Those too young, too old, or residing in unrelated locations were eliminated. This continually narrowed the scope, from dozens of initial names to a smaller group, making suspect narrowing concrete for the first time in years. As the potential suspect group formed, the cold case unit cross-referenced them with the 1994 file. This was where genetic genealogy showed its power, not just as science, but as a bridge between present and past. Investigators flipped through old pages, seeking any overlap, however small, between new names and those from the original investigation. Most had no clear connection, but then one name unexpectedly appeared, not in old suspect lists, but in 1994 file, marginal notes. This name wasn't entirely unfamiliar. It had been mentioned as someone in the area when Laura vanished, but in 1994, their presence wasn't deemed suspicious. No clear contradictions in statements, no physical evidence, and most crucially, no grounds to hold them. As the investigation shifted hypotheses, and the case cooled, the name faded from focus, surviving only as a line in the file. Now, with genetic genealogy bringing it back, the coincidence sent chills through those reading the file. The cold case unit didn't rush to conclusions. They knew a familiar name re-emerging could be the key, or a misleading coincidence. However, what they couldn't ignore was how it fit multiple pieces: age matching the DNA profile, family links aligning with the tree, and undeniable geographic presence in Danville. Then details once secondary in 1994 now carried new meaning, as if illuminated from a fresh angle. The familiar name's reappearance marked a crucial psychological turning point. For the first time, the cold case unit felt they weren't chasing faint traces, but approaching a specific person with verifiable history, relationships, and motives. Genetic genealogy didn't accuse, but did what decades of traditional investigation couldn't: narrow suspicion to a manageable human level. As the family tree refined and suspects tightened, investigators realized they stood at a new case boundary. Behind them, decades of stalemate; ahead, a narrow but clearer path than ever. That familiar name was no longer an old note, but the focus of new questions: questions the cold case unit believed they now had tools to pursue fully. Genetic genealogy turned an anonymous DNA sample into a family map, and on that map, truth was gradually emerging, branch by branch, unable to return to silence. When the familiar name re-emerged from genetic genealogy, the cold case unit knew they were entering the investigation's most sensitive phase. This was no longer expanding hypotheses or abstract narrowing, but directly confronting a specific person who had passed through the 1994 file without leaving strong enough marks to be retained. To avoid repeating past mistakes, investigators decided not to approach this suspect via intuition or professional memory, but through a cold, systematic cross-check, placing old file against new data, detail by detail. The 1994 file was reviewed from the start, especially pages related to this former suspect. Investigators read every note line, every question asked in the initial interview, and those not asked. Back then, the person's statement was deemed coherent, with no surface contradictions, fitting the assumption Laura followed her familiar route, but with that assumption shaken, the entire statement needed re-examination in new light. The cold case unit started by comparing the 1994 timeline to the alternative they built after challenging the old assumption. Time markers once reasonable no longer aligned. In the original statement, the suspect described meeting and parting from Laura in an unremarkable way, but cross-checked against the overlooked time gap, investigators saw an unexplained segment. In 1994, it wasn't an issue, filled by assuming Laura continued alone. Now, with that assumption unstable, the period became a critical break needing questions. Next, investigators compared geographic data. In 1994, without location tracking, route verification relied on statements. With new data, including movement info, residency records, and family ties from genetic genealogy, the picture sharpened. Places the suspect claimed to visit or avoid were set against locations the tree and public records linked them to. Overlaps weren't overt for direct proof, but enough to raise questions unasked. In 1994, why the described route didn't fully match inferable current data. The cold case unit also revisited motive, once downplayed due to no clear conflict. With new data, they saw broader 1994 life context for the suspect, including personal relationships, financial pressures, and routine changes the old file didn't fully reflect. No single detail accused, but together, they painted a far more complex picture than the minor figure in old records. It was during this comparison that a key contradiction emerged, not as opposing words, but as unasked and unclear aspects. In 1994, investigators hadn't fully cross-checked the suspect's statement against small reports and marginal statements, as they didn't fit the used assumption. Now, placing those documents beside the old statement revealed a mismatch, a detail that, if probed then, might have shifted the investigation. The cold case unit noted this contradiction wasn't direct evidence, but a sign of an incomplete story. It showed the 1994 surface coherent statement was accepted too quickly, with story gaps no one required the suspect to fill. With new genetic genealogy data, those gaps were no longer invisible. They stood in the light as unanswered questions, demanding to be re-asked. Comparing old file to new data didn't yield an immediate confession or decisive proof, but it completely shifted the former suspect's case position. The once temporarily ruled-out person now became the attention focus, not from one clue, but convergence of many once downplayed small details. The cold case unit knew they walked a thin line between reasonable suspicion and concrete evidence, and every next step required absolute caution. At the end of the comparison phase, investigators no longer saw this suspect as an old name pulled from the file, but as a real person with an untold full story. New data didn't rewrite the past, but forced it to answer questions it once evaded, and in those unasked 1994 contradictions, the cold case unit began seeing the path to the investigation's next decisive step. When the former suspect was brought back to the investigation center by new data, the cold case unit knew they had entered an extremely fragile phase. Any misstep now could ruin years of effort, as they faced not just a specific person, but tight legal limits. No arrest warrant, no confession, no direct incriminating evidence yet. Every next action had to occur in silence. The investigation shifted to secretive mode, where each step was carefully calculated to avoid alerting the suspect or signaling that Laura Bennett's file was reviving. The investigators began by monitoring the suspect in the present, not to seek new criminal behavior, but to understand the person they were facing. They recorded daily habits, social relationships, workplace and locations the person frequented. Everything was gathered from legal and public sources, from administrative records, to field observations, to build a comprehensive picture without invading personal rights. Notably, the suspect seemed to live a relatively private life, with no clear unusual signs, which made the investigators even more cautious in their approach. Parallel to the monitoring, the cold case unit focused on the most critical goal, legally obtaining a comparison DNA sample. They couldn't rely on speculation or psychological pressure. They needed a biological sample, directly comparable to the profile from the evidence. This required patience, as any hasty action could alert the suspect or render evidence inadmissible in court. The investigators watched for situations where the suspect naturally left biological traces in public spaces, strictly adhering to legal regulations. The waiting period for the comparison DNA sample was the most tense phase of the investigation. Investigators were not allowed to show emotions or exchange too much information, even with colleagues not directly involved. Everything occurred in a small scope, with the number of people knowing the truth limited to the maximum. Meanwhile, alongside the secret field work, another group in the cold case unit began equally important work, reconstructing the timeline of the night Laura Bennett vanished in a completely new way. This time, the timeline was no longer bound by the familiar route assumption. The investigators placed the suspect in the context of the 1994 night, cross-referencing their possible position with the once undervalued time gap. Old statement time markers were set against new data from genetic genealogy and overlooked reports. When reconstructing the event sequence this way, a different order began to emerge, not complete, but enough to show the suspect might have been near Laura longer than previously accepted. The time gap, once a vague issue, now became the center of the new timeline. The investigators tested various scenarios, each placing the suspect in different positions during that period, then checking which could most reasonably explain the vehicle's unusual location, the strange DNA sample's appearance, and the lack of struggle signs. No scenario was perfect, but some repeated alarming common points, indicating a high likelihood Laura wasn't alone in the evening's decisive phase. During this, the cold case unit was especially careful not to fall into the trap of rewriting the past to fit the suspect. Every hypothesis had to be challenged with the reverse question: if the suspect was uninvolved, would this event sequence still make sense? Only scenarios passing internal skepticism were retained for further analysis. This was a lesson directly drawn from 1994 mistakes, when an initial assumption guided the entire investigation without strong enough questioning. When the comparison DNA sample was finally collected and sent for testing, the cold case unit didn't change their external work pace. The suspect wasn't approached, interviewed, or given any sign of being under a microscope. For the investigators, this was the phase requiring the highest discipline, as one small error could lead the suspect to destroy evidence or prepare a counter scenario. In the workspace, the new timeline gradually completed, not as a conclusive story, but as a hypothesis map for next steps. The investigators viewed it cautiously, understanding everything they were doing only held value if the comparison DNA confirmed this direction was correct. But unlike previous case phases, this time they didn't feel groping in the dark. The secret investigation, though slow and tense, was moving forward with a clearer goal than ever. As the secret investigation continued, the cold case unit stood at the boundary between past and present. One side, Laura Bennett's 1994 disappearance, with flawed decisions and overlooked clues. The other, a person living in the present, unaware their smallest traces, could directly connect to a night decades past. And in this absolute silence, with everything occurring out of public view, the investigation drew closer than ever to the moment truth could no longer be hidden. The comparison DNA test results were delivered to the cold case unit in a sealed envelope. No sensational headline, no emotional commentary, just a scientific report presented to forensic standards. But for those pursuing the Laura Bennett case for years, this was the moment the entire process aimed toward. The legally collected DNA profile from the suspect matched the strange DNA sample found on evidence directly related to Laura, with probability excluding all random chance. Not partial similarity, not a possible result, but a match at an absolute scientific level, enough to withstand any court challenge. The cold case unit didn't allow hasty reactions. The report was reread multiple times, by different people, each checking a different process aspect. The sample custody chain was cross-checked from comparison DNA collection to lab analysis, ensuring no legal gaps. Investigators knew in cold cases, even the strongest evidence could be destroyed by one improper step. When all checks yielded perfection, no doubt remained about the conclusion's validity. The person leaving biological traces on the evidence was the former suspect from the 1994 file. The DNA match didn't just confirm the suspect's presence, but illuminated all foggy points existing for decades. The timeline time gap, once undervalued and set aside, now had clear meaning. The related vehicle's unusual location was no longer a meaningless mystery, but a logical consequence of events involving a third party. Small overlooked reports and uncross-verified statements from back then began connecting, forming a complete picture the original investigation never saw. Immediately after confirming the DNA results, the cold case unit moved to the equally decisive next step, re-examining the suspect's old statement under the new evidence light. The 1994 statement was once evaluated as coherent, with no surface contradictions, leading to temporary exclusion. But now, with the suspect's presence at the critical time scientifically proven, every word in that statement was analyzed again. The investigators reconstructed the entire statement in chronological order, placing each suspect-provided time marker into the newly calibrated timeline. Doing so revealed a key contradiction clearer than ever. The suspect had claimed leaving Laura earlier than reality, enough to create a safe distance in 1994 investigators' reasoning. That time lacked independent data for verification, so the marker was accepted as fact. Now, DNA proved the suspect remained near Laura during the period the statement claimed no involvement. The old statement wasn't just inaccurate, but systematically false. The cold case unit continued cross-referencing other statement details with new data. The described route no longer fit actual movement possibilities, considering the biological trace location. Details once neutral now showed evasion signs, as if the story was adjusted to fit 1994 investigation's common assumption, not fully reflecting truth. The statement's surface coherence, once helping the suspect escape suspicion, now became indirect evidence of intent to conceal. With the DNA match and old statement proven false, the investigation entered a comprehensive criminal evaluation phase. This was no longer about possibility or hypothesis but legal accountability. Prosecutors were involved early, reviewing the entire file from 1994 to present. Every cold case unit step was scrutinized, reopening the file, retesting evidence, using genetic genealogy, collecting comparison DNA, and reconstructing the timeline anew. The goal wasn't just proving truth, but ensuring it could stand in court. In lengthy sessions, each evidence piece was placed together to see if they formed an unbreakable logical chain. DNA placed the suspect at the case's center. False statement proved intent to mislead investigation. New timeline explained every anomaly once stalling the case, from time gap to vehicle position. No confession needed, as science and data told the full story. After completing evaluation, the conclusion was cautious but firm, sufficient criminal grounds to proceed with next prosecutorial steps. This wasn't an emotional decision, but the result of convergence between scientific evidence, logical analysis, and tight legal process. For the cold case unit, this moment held special meaning. It not only marked a cold case finally solved, but evidenced the value of patience and daring to revisit old assumptions. When the final comprehensive report was completed, investigators looked back at the Laura Bennett case journey with an indescribable feeling. 1994 mistakes couldn't be erased, and years of Laura's absence couldn't be returned. But truth was finally locked by undeniable evidence. From this point, the case was no longer a story of a woman vanishing in silence, but a criminal file ready for official justice. And as the cold case unit signed the next decision, they knew the evidence had spoken long and clearly enough that no one could turn away from it anymore. After evidence was locked and the sufficient criminal grounds conclusion unified internally, the cold case unit entered an equally tense phase, preparing arrest. This was where the smallest error could destroy the file built with decades of patience. Investigators understood from this moment, the case was no longer just an investigation but a legal process, where every word and procedure faced strict judicial scrutiny. The first step was direct work with the assigned prosecutor. Lengthy meetings occurred behind closed doors, where the entire file was presented from start to finish, omitting no detail. The cold case unit provided not just the DNA match results, but explained each evidence context, why that evidence was collected, why it couldn't be tested in 1994, and how new technology changed its value. The prosecutor constantly asked questions, not to refute but to challenge the file at the highest level, as defense counsel surely would in court. A major focus of the sessions was the suspect's old statement. The prosecutor required the cold case unit to clearly prove the statement wasn't just wrong, but wrong in a legally meaningful way. Investigators had to show direct links between the false statement and efforts to mislead investigation, as well as how it exploited 1994's flawed assumption to create a safe gap. This demanded tight connections between new data, reconstructed timeline, and original investigation context, ensuring arguments relied on logic and evidence, not speculation. Parallel to strengthening the charging file, the prosecutor and cold case unit conducted legal risk assessment. They examined every possibility defense could exploit: genetic genealogy's legality, evidence custody chain over years, and privacy related to comparison DNA collection. Each potential weakness was dissected beforehand, not to hide but to reinforce. Investigators provided documents proving every step complied with current law, and no evidence was obtained by violating the suspect's personal rights. A key question was raised repeatedly in meetings: whether the passage of time would weaken the ability to prosecute. The prosecutor required the cold case unit to clarify why the case could be brought to trial after many years, and why the delay was not the result of negligence, but of technological limitations and flawed investigative assumptions that had been identified and corrected. The answer did not lie in a single piece of evidence, but in the entire journey of the case, demonstrating the ongoing efforts of the authorities to seek the truth, even if it meant waiting decades. Once the legal risks had been assessed and the weaknesses reinforced, the prosecutor began drafting the affidavit for the arrest warrant. This was a decisive document, where the entire story had to be presented concisely yet completely, sufficient to convince the judge that there was probable cause to deprive an individual of their liberty. The cold case unit worked closely in this process, providing investigative summaries, timeline diagrams, and analyses linking the DNA, the false statements, and the disappearance of Laura Bennett. Every sentence in the arrest warrant affidavit was carefully weighed. There was no room for emotion or speculative language. Every assertion had to be based on specific, verifiable evidence. The investigators understood that the judge did not need to know the full tragedy of the case, but needed to see clear legal grounds for authorizing the arrest. For that reason, the details that had haunted the investigation were distilled, retaining only those elements that directly strengthened the criminal probable cause. While the arrest warrant affidavit was being finalized, the cold case unit simultaneously prepared for the next scenarios. They assessed the risks involved in executing the arrest, including the possibility of the suspect fleeing, destroying remaining evidence, or posing a danger to themselves or others. Information gathered from the secret surveillance phase was used to determine the safest timing and location for the arrest, ensuring that the execution of the warrant would be swift and the situation controlled. Finally, when all documents were ready, the arrest warrant affidavit was submitted to the judge. The moment of waiting for the decision was one of the heaviest for the cold case unit. No one spoke much, because they understood that from this point, the outcome was no longer entirely in their hands. Years of effort were placed into a single legal decision. When the arrest warrant was approved, there was no celebration. Instead, there was focused silence. The cold case unit knew they had just passed a major milestone, but the road ahead was still long. Preparing the arrest was not just the final step of the investigation, but the bridge that brought the Laura Bennett case from the world of files and laboratories into the world of courts and justice. And in that moment, the investigators understood that everything they had done, from reopening the file, challenging old assumptions, to locking down the evidence, converged on a single goal: ensuring that when the cell door closed, it was closed by the truth, not by mistake or haste. The warrant was approved in silence, without fanfare, without widespread announcement, and immediately, the execution plan was activated exactly as the cold case unit had prepared over the previous weeks. The timing was not random, but based on careful assessments of daily habits, risk levels, and situational control. The goal was to arrest the suspect at their residence, under absolutely safe conditions, avoiding any unnecessary escalation. For the investigators, this was not just a law enforcement task, but the culmination of decades of errors, patience, and correction. That morning in Danville unfolded like any other. The familiar streets began to see traffic, shops opened, and no one in the town knew that one of their most haunting missing persons cases was about to enter a new chapter. The arrest team approached the suspect's residence discreetly, without sirens, without creating any unusual signs. Positions were clearly assigned, each person knew their exact role, and every contingency scenario had been discussed beforehand. When the investigators knocked on the door, the waiting moment lasted only a few seconds but felt heavy. The door opened, and the suspect appeared in the doorway in a way no different from the images the cold case unit had observed during the secret surveillance. There was no panic, no attempt to flee, and no violent reaction. The investigators quickly identified themselves, announced the arrest warrant, and clearly read the suspect their rights as required. Everything proceeded slowly and precisely, like a procedure rehearsed many times. The suspect did not resist. There were no loud protests, no attempts to run, just a prolonged moment of silence as the information was absorbed. On this person's face, no clear emotion was evident, no fear, no anger, nor surprise to an incomprehensible degree. For the investigators, that very calm carried a particular weight, because it contrasted completely with the chaos the case had caused over the years. The arrest was completed quickly. The suspect was handcuffed and led out under tight control but without any struggle. There were no neighbors gathering, no waiting camera lights, and in the first few minutes, it seemed only those directly involved understood the significance of this moment. For the cold case unit, this was not an action movie scene, but the result of a lengthy legal and scientific process, where everything had to be precise down to the smallest detail. As the suspect was placed in the vehicle and left the residence, the information began to spread beyond the investigation team. The Danville Police Headquarters received the first calls from involved units, then from local media outlets once the information was officially confirmed. In a short time, the name Laura Bennett, which had faded into silence for many years, reappeared in the news. But this time, it was accompanied by a phrase many thought they would never hear: suspect arrested. Danville was shocked not by chaotic street scenes, but by a widespread sense of stunned disbelief in the community. Those who had lived in the town since 1994 began reconnecting memories, recalling the search days, the flyers posted on poles, and the lingering unease when a person vanished without a trace. The arrest at the suspect's residence, a person who had lived among the community for many years, sent chills through many. It raised uncomfortable questions about who they had passed on the street, greeted, without knowing that person's past was tied to one of the town's greatest tragedies. Within the investigation team, the atmosphere carried varied tones. There was relief that the work had finally reached the point they had hoped for, but also caution, because they knew the arrest was only the beginning of a new, harsher phase. Every action from this point forward would be publicly scrutinized, and the case file they had built would have to withstand courtroom challenges. There was no room for complacency or personal emotion. The press release was carefully prepared, disclosing only necessary information, avoiding any speculation or unproven conclusions. The cold case unit emphasized that the arrest was the result of long-term investigation, modern forensic technology, and close cooperation with the prosecutor. No sensational details, no emotional statements, just the affirmation that the Laura Bennett case had entered a new phase. For Danville, the shock came not from the manner of the arrest, but from its meaning. A missing persons case once considered unsolvable, now had an arrested suspect, and that forced the entire town to revisit its past. Questions once buried were raised again, old memories revived, and with them came a feeling of both relief and pain. Relief because there was finally an answer, pain because that answer came too late. As the suspect was placed in temporary detention, the door closing not only on a person, but on a long period of silence and helplessness. The cold case unit stood quietly for a few moments, no one speaking, because they understood this moment did not belong to them, but to Laura Bennett, who disappeared on an autumn night in 1994, and never had the chance to tell her story. The arrest did not close the case, but it marked a clear boundary between past and present. From here the truth would be tested publicly, evidence debated in court, and Danville would have to confront what had been overlooked for many years. In that quiet shock, one thing became undeniable: the disappearance of Laura Bennett was no longer a lingering question in the community's memory. It had become a living criminal case, with a suspect arrested right in the heart of the town that once believed this story would forever remain unresolved. The interrogation took place just a few hours after the suspect's arrest, in a small room with cold white lighting, containing nothing but a metal table, 2 chairs, and a recording device already turned on. No longer indirect questions or probing like in 1994, this time the suspect entered the room as a lawfully arrested person, fully aware that this conversation could determine the rest of their life. The investigators maintained a calm tone, no pressure, no direct accusations, because they knew the weight of the evidence would create more pressure than any words. From the very first questions, differences from the old statements began to emerge clearly. When asked to recount the night Laura Bennett disappeared, the suspect repeated many familiar details from the 1994 statement, as if reciting an old script. But this time, the investigators did not let the story flow uninterrupted. They interrupted at pre-marked points, asking for clarification on times, distances, and sequence of actions. Each time, the responses began to falter, the timelines no longer aligning as before. The contradictions did not explode immediately, but built up gradually with each question. When asked about the time of leaving Laura, the suspect gave a time different from what had been previously stated, only off by a few minutes, but enough for the investigators to note it. When asked further about the subsequent movements, the description became vaguer, lacking the specific details that had appeared in the old statement. These changes, taken individually, could be explained by fading memory over time, but when placed side by side, they formed an unstable chain, showing the story was being adjusted in real time. The investigators began more direct comparisons, not by immediately presenting evidence, but by asking the same question in different forms. The same time period, the same location, but each rephrasing yielded a different expression. The suspect tried to remain calm, but tension gradually showed in longer pauses before answering. This was what the investigators had been waiting for, not to corner, but to observe how the story contradicted itself when no longer protected by the old 1994 assumptions. As the interrogation deepened, the investigators for the first time indirectly referenced the scientific evidence, without specifics, only asking about the possibility of close contact with Laura in the previously overlooked time gap. The suspect's reaction changed noticeably. A small detail in the response was drawn out unusually, as if the speaker was carefully weighing each word, and in that moment, a crucial detail emerged, not through confession, but through information never before mentioned in any prior statement. The suspect referenced a specific action that occurred in the time period the 1994 file considered to have no interaction. This detail, though mentioned casually, immediately caused the investigators to exchange glances. It not only placed the suspect in the critical time gap, but also explained why their presence had not been identified earlier. The detail fit disturbingly well with the unusual vehicle position and the appearance of the DNA sample not belonging to Laura. The investigators did not react immediately. They let the suspect continue speaking, because they knew the value of this detail lay in how it was revealed, not in forcing it. When asked again about the just mentioned detail, the suspect tried to retract, adjusting the response to a safer direction, but it was too late. The sudden shift in phrasing made the contradiction clear, not only to those in the room, but on the recording that would be presented in court. The interrogation continued for a while longer, but the pace had changed. The suspect no longer fully controlled their narrative. Responses became shorter, more guarded, and silences appeared more frequently. The investigators did not need to introduce the matching DNA or other evidence at this point. The crucial detail had emerged, and it stood on its own as a piece the suspect could not take back. When the interrogation ended, there was no formal confession. The suspect was returned to temporary detention, carrying heavy silence. For the cold case unit, this was not a failure. On the contrary, they knew the goal of the session was not to force an immediate admission of guilt, but to test the suspect's story under the pressure of existing evidence. And in the process, they had achieved something more important: an inexplicable contradiction, and a new detail never before in the file. When the investigators later reviewed the recording, the revealed detail was marked, cross-referenced with the new timeline and physical evidence. It matched coldly with what they had long suspected. The post-arrest interrogation did not close the case, but it added another solid layer to the charging file. In the chain of events stretching from 1994 to the present, this was the first time the suspect's own words placed them at the center of the fateful time gap, where Laura Bennett disappeared, and where the truth finally began to emerge. The trial opened in the heavy atmosphere of a case that had spanned more than 3 decades, where everyone present understood that this was not just the prosecution of an individual, but a test of the entire investigative journey of the justice system. As the defendant was led into the courtroom, Danville fell silent in the distinctive way of a small town confronting its own past. Laura Bennett was not there to tell her story, and therefore that responsibility fell on the prosecutors, who had to reconstruct the entire investigative thread logically, persuasively, and without leaving any room for reasonable doubt. The prosecution began by taking the jury back to 1994, not to recount the tragedy, but to explain the professional context of the initial investigation. They presented how Laura was reported missing, how the Danville police acted in the early days, and why certain assumptions that seemed reasonable at the time shaped the entire direction of the case. The prosecution did not avoid the professional errors, but proactively acknowledged them, emphasizing that this was not a story of a perfect investigation, but a story of how the truth can be obscured when assumptions go untested. This very frankness laid the foundation for their central argument: the case was not solved incorrectly, but solved according to an incomplete logic. Step by step, the prosecution rebuilt the new investigative thread, starting with the reopening of the cold case file. They explained to the jury why evidence that seemed forever silent could speak again thanks to modern DNA technology, and how genetic genealogy had lawfully narrowed the suspect pool. The focus of the presentation was not the novelty of the technology, but the professional logic behind its use. When old data was no longer sufficient, the system had to employ new tools to answer old questions. When reaching the matching DNA portion, the prosecution presented it in a calm voice, without dramatization. They demonstrated the continuous chain of custody from 1994 to the present, ruling out contamination or tampering. The DNA was not introduced as isolated evidence, but as the central piece connecting disparate details: the unusual vehicle position, the time gap in the timeline, and the defendant's false statements. The prosecution stressed that if there were only DNA without accompanying professional logic, the case would not hold, but when DNA was placed in the proper context, it became irrefutable evidence. The defense countered forcefully on that very point. They focused on the age of the evidence, emphasizing that it had been collected more than 30 years earlier, under conditions and standards far different from today. The defense attorney raised questions about cross-contamination possibilities, about DNA potentially being left in an innocent context, and about the risk that investigators had found what they wanted to find when reopening the file. They also reminded the jury that the defendant had been interviewed in 1994 and not charged, implying that the system was trying to correct the past by imposing new conclusions on old data. In response, the prosecution did not argue with emotion, but returned to professional logic. They pointed out that the defendant's lack of arrest in 1994 was not proof of innocence, but a consequence of technological limitations and flawed investigative assumptions that had been clearly identified. The prosecution walked the jury through each step of reconstructing the timeline, showing how the defendant's old statements once fit the familiar route assumption, and why, when that assumption was debunked, the statements no longer held up. The focus was not on faded memory, but on systematic contradictions between the statements and physical evidence. When the defense attacked genetic genealogy, questioning privacy and legality, the prosecution detailed the legal steps that had been followed. They clarified that genetic genealogy was not used to directly charge, but only to identify suspects, and that the defendant's comparison DNA was obtained entirely lawfully, independent of genealogical data. This helped the jury understand that there were no shortcuts in the investigative process, only a tightly controlled chain of decisions. The trial's focus gradually converged on professional logic, whether the entire sequence of actions by the investigating agency, from reopening the file, retesting evidence, rebuilding the timeline, to the arrest and interrogation, formed a consistent logical system or not. The prosecution argued that each step, taken alone, could be doubted, but when placed together they eliminated every other reasonable possibility. The defense tried to create alternative scenarios, but each one stumbled on the same question: if the defendant was uninvolved, how to explain the matching DNA, the false statements, and the presence in the critical time gap. As the trial entered its final stage, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew thick. This was no longer a debate about technology or procedure, but a confrontation between two ways of understanding the truth. One side argued the case was too old for certainty, the other asserted that precisely because it was old, every piece of evidence had to meet the highest logical standard. In their closing, the prosecution returned to the core. Laura Bennett did not disappear into a mysterious void, but into a sequence of events that could be understood when the pieces were placed correctly. They did not ask the jury to believe in the system, but to believe in the logic that DNA does not lie, that false statements have meaning, and that truth does not fade with time, only waits to be seen properly. The trial ended in that tense silence, where the entire investigative journey was placed on the scales, and Danville awaited a verdict, not just for the defendant, but for the town's unresolved past. The verdict was announced on a quiet afternoon, when the courtroom was so silent that the sound of papers being turned on the judge's desk could be clearly heard. After many days of deliberation, the jury returned with tense faces, carrying the weight of a decision, not just for the defendant, but for an entire community that had lived more than 30 years waiting for an answer. As everyone rose for the ritual, the atmosphere in the courtroom held no explosive suspense, but a compressed sense of expectations prepared for an outcome that could never be complete. The judge read the verdict in a slow, clear voice, each word chosen to avoid any ambiguity. The court found the defendant criminally responsible in the disappearance of Laura Bennett, based on the totality of evidence presented throughout the trial. The verdict emphasized that the conclusion did not stem from a single clue, but from a consistent chain of professional logic, matching DNA evidence, old statements proven systematically false, an unexplainable time gap under any other reasonable scenario, and an investigative process reconstructed lawfully and transparently. As those words echoed in the courtroom, there was no outburst. No one cried out, no one jumped up. The defendant stood still, face almost expressionless, as if the verdict had been anticipated. For many present, that moment did not bring the relief they had once imagined, but a cold confirmation that the worst had finally been officially named. Justice had spoken, but it could not erase the years Laura was gone, nor fully answer what truly happened on that final night. The judge continued to clarify the scope of the verdict, stressing that the court could only rely on what was lawfully proven. This was not a solution to every mystery, but an official recognition of criminal responsibility within the limits of available evidence. The court could not recreate every moment of the night Laura disappeared, could not provide a complete account, and could not heal the voids time had carved into the memories of the family and community. The verdict, in the judge's words, was the end of a legal process, not the complete closure of a human tragedy. For the cold case unit, the moment the verdict was announced carried layers of conflicting emotions. There was relief that the entire investigative logic they had painstakingly built had withstood the court, but also a heavy feeling because they knew this was not a victory in the conventional sense. They had proven legal responsibility, but could not bring Laura back, could not restore the lost years to her family, and could not erase the sense that the truth had come too late. The defense quickly announced they would consider an appeal, reiterating arguments from the trial about the age of the evidence and applying new technology to old cases. That surprised no one in the courtroom. In cases like this, a verdict is rarely an absolute final period. It is often a milestone where the legal story can continue in another form, extending time and debate. Outside the courthouse, Danville reacted in the distinctive way of a town that had lived with the case too long. No cheering crowds, no celebrations, instead, quiet conversations, slow nods, and a feeling of both release and emptiness. Many said there was finally an answer, but that answer did not bring complete closure. It was like closing a door left open too long, only to realize what lay behind it still haunted. The verdict also forced the community to confront an uncomfortable reality. For many years, Laura Bennett's disappearance had existed alongside Danville's daily life, becoming part of the collective memory. Wrong assumptions, rumors, and prolonged silence were now exposed to the light of a legal conclusion. But that light did not erase the darkness entirely, only clarified its shape. As the judge declared the trial over, the courtroom gradually emptied, leaving an indescribable quiet. The verdict had been delivered, responsibility determined, but no one left feeling everything was fully resolved. The Laura Bennett case had a legal ending, but not the complete one people hoped for. Laura remained an irreplaceable absence, and Danville still carried the memory of an autumn night in 1994, like an indelible scar. The court's verdict provided a necessary period for the justice system, but behind that period was a lingering silence, where the family, community, and even those who investigated the case had to find their own ways to live with the truth just named. Justice had done its part, but it carried no promise of peace, and in that incompleteness, the verdict became both necessary and insufficient, truly reflecting the nature of a missing persons case that left behind more than it could take away. After the trial concluded and the verdict was announced, the Laura Bennett case officially left the courtroom to enter a different, quieter, but no less heavy phase. For the justice system, this was the moment the file was closed, procedures completed, and the case recorded as legally resolved. But for the investigators who had pursued it for years, especially those present in the early days of 1994, the story did not end there. It shifted to another state: reflection, evaluation, and confronting errors once accepted as normal. In internal meetings after the trial, the cold case unit and Danville police leadership spent considerable time reanalyzing the entire initial investigation process, not to assign blame to individuals, but to understand why a wrong assumption could persist so long unchallenged. In 1994, pressure for quick answers, technological limitations, and the professional mindset of the time led some investigative directions to be accepted too soon. Assuming Laura traveled her familiar route inadvertently narrowed thinking, causing small contradictions in statements and peripheral details to be undervalued. The investigators recognized that the biggest error was not lack of effort, but lack of self-doubt mechanisms. Once an initial assumption was accepted, it became the frame for every subsequent decision, and any information not fitting that frame was downplayed or set aside. In the Laura Bennett case, this led to a potential suspect being cleared too early, not because evidence proved innocence, but because their story fit the operating assumption. Acknowledging these errors was not easy, especially for those who had dedicated careers to investigation. But after the verdict, frankness became necessary. The investigators understood that without properly recognizing what went wrong, the system risked repeating those mistakes in other cases. The Laura Bennett case became a vivid lesson, not about incompetence, but about the limits of professional thinking when not continually scrutinized. The impact of this case did not stop at Danville. Soon after the verdict, cold case units in the region and at the state level began reviewing old files with similar characteristics, unsolved disappearances, where an initial assumption had guided the entire investigation. Reviews were conducted, focusing on cases where seemingly coherent statements were accepted too quickly, or evidence once deemed insufficient for deeper analysis. DNA technology and genetic genealogy, which played key roles in the Laura Bennett case, were now seen as strategic tools rather than stopgaps. But investigators also clearly recognized that technology cannot replace professional thinking. The lesson was the combination of modern science and the ability to re-ask questions of old assumptions. No tool automatically delivers truth if used incorrectly by people. In internal training sessions, the Laura Bennett case was cited as a classic example, not to celebrate the ultimate success, but to analyze the long path to it. Younger investigators heard about the 1994 decisions, how a small overlooked detail could derail an entire investigation, and the importance of noting inconsistencies, even without immediate explanations. The case became a reminder that in criminal investigation, patience and skepticism are as valuable as any advanced technology. For the Danville community, the case's closure also brought a period of self-examination. Many began reflecting on how the town had lived with the disappearance for years, how assumptions and rumors formed, and how silence gradually became part of daily life. The verdict did not erase that collective memory, but forced questions about accepting prolonged uncertainty, and the community's responsibility in keeping difficult questions alive. The Laura Bennett case also created a ripple effect for other families awaiting answers in cold cases. It showed that closing a case after decades is possible, but never easy, and rarely complete. Late justice is still justice, but always accompanied by irreplaceable losses. The key is for the system to learn how to minimize those losses in the future. As time passed after the trial, Laura Bennett's name appeared less in the news, but the case's mark did not vanish. It lived in procedural changes, in how investigators approach old files, and in new caution facing seemingly obvious assumptions. The case did not just close a personal story, but opened a new chapter in how the system views cold cases. Ultimately, the Laura Bennett case left no simple message. It did not claim every case can be solved, nor promise technology will always provide answers. Instead, it reminded that truth is often obscured, not by lack of evidence, but by lack of willingness to re-ask questions. When the case closed, what remained was not just the verdict, but the responsibility to keep learning from the past, so the errors of 1994 do not repeat in other cases, still waiting to be heard. The Laura Bennett case in Danville, Illinois, is not just a solved cold case story, but a very real mirror of how life in America today can still be shaped by assumptions we accept too quickly. In 1994, police built a timeline based on what seemed a reasonable assumption. Laura took her familiar route. That assumption blurred offbeat signs, a minor report not cross-checked, a statement not verified, to let the case slide into silence and evidence sealed in storage. The first lesson for us, in work and life: don't let a story that sounds right become absolute truth. When making big decisions, choosing a job, a person, a path, ask yourself, what if this assumption is wrong, and force verification with facts, not just feeling. The second lesson is the power of methodical patience. The cold case unit did not hope for miracles. They worked like science, retesting evidence with new DNA tech, finding a sample not Laura's, then using genetic genealogy to build family trees and narrow suspects. In today's fast news, social media America full of rushed conclusions, the attitude to learn is slow down, recheck, and rely on process. And finally, late justice still has value, but never complete. The verdict helped Danville close the file, but could not bring Laura back. So if you have a loved one hard to reach, a situation not right like Laura's family felt that night, act early, note timelines, keep information, and don't hesitate to seek help. In America today, Safety and truth sometimes start with not staying silent when your instinct says something is wrong. If you want to keep following stories of cold cases revisited with evidence, logic, and late arriving truth, subscribe to the channel to join us on the journey, seeking justice for forgotten voices. Thank you for following Laura Bennett's story, and see you in the next video, where another case will be opened, and the truth once again placed under the light.